The COO Roundtable brings together operations professionals at the top of their game to define and explore what it means to be highly effective in a scale-up organization. And what sits at the heart of it is highly curated peer-to-peer roundtables where COOs talk about things that matter.
I absolutely love my roundtable. We've been together for about 2 years, and without exaggeration, I have made friends for life.
To find out more, go to cooroundtable.com. That's cooroundtable.com. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Operations Room, a podcast for COOs. I am Brandon Mensinga, joined by my lovely co-host Bethany Ayers. How are things going, Bethany?
It's been a long week. It's Friday. It feels like Monday was maybe 3 or 4 lifetimes ago.
One of those weeks.
One of those weeks where I ended up just reposting your post on LinkedIn because my brain was dead yesterday. I had nothing I could possibly add to the podcast in any way.
No creative juices to squeeze out at that point.
No, I was done. And yet, here we are on the Friday, ready to roll.
Yes, amazing. So I understand you did your second episode. What were you calling it? I guess like second kick at the can.
So some people are calling it a webinar, but because you know me and anything formal and anything contained, and I just have an allergic reaction. So maybe we'll call it the Zoom hour. So after horrific technical issues, what we talked about was how to choose your life partner so you can have it all. It was for women who are aspiring execs or current execs. And so people who want to have full-time corporate jobs. So we had some tips and tricks on how to choose well in my experience. And I did this accidentally myself and subsequently have seen stats on this that women who earn well and have big careers and are married and have children, their partners, mothers, worked outside the home. So basically, if you're looking to maintain your career, partner up with a man whose mother worked outside the house. My husband's mother worked outside the home. I did not have that as one of my criteria, but in retrospect, it was a very good one, as is having an awesome mother-in-law. And by awesome, I don't just mean giving you space and understanding that you're creating a new life and letting go of her son, but also has instilled in her son that it's his responsibility to do his own laundry, clean his room, figure out his shit. And then the other women who shared their experiences, interestingly, their husbands had that same upbringing. So our little micro environment seemed to play out the stats that have shown. Those are just a couple of hints. I mean, I think it just depends on what kind of life you're looking to lead and therefore choosing it thoughtfully. The one other hint is why I preferred a nanny over daycare and realized that it had nothing to do with what's best for children, because you get all these philosophical things of like daycare's better because they're socialized, nanny's better because they bond with a single caregiver and they fight. And it's like, they're going to be okay. As long as there's love in your house and there's stability of where they go, babies are fine. Toddlers are fine. It really doesn't matter. But as a working mother, a nanny is so much better for you because you basically hire in a wife. And so what you should be looking at for when you hire a nanny isn't just that they're loving and care about children, but you should be hiring for nannies who will be proactive and remove that mental load. Like, again, we accidentally hired an amazing nanny the first time. She booked all of their appointments, got them to the vaccines, had to sign the right paperwork, booked in all of their classes, organized their lunches, told us what to buy, and would even like put all of the shopping in an online shopping cart. All I had to do was buy it. And when she left, and we hired other nannies because they were loving for the kids, none of them took that on. It all fell on me. And I just collapsed after a while and couldn't do it anymore and hadn't realized how important having somebody who can do that thinking for you is if you're both going to have high power jobs.
Yeah, I think that is a great recommendation because in daycare, you're obviously not going to get that level of support. And that's like a quantum difference in a lot of ways. All right. So we have got a great topic for today, which is, does performance management work? And we have an amazing guest for this, which is Jessica Zwaan. She is the author of the best-selling book, Built for People, and she's also the COO of Talentful. So before we get to Jessica Zwaan, just wanted to do a quick back and forth between ourselves. And what I wanted to start with is there was a report that I read last week talking about performance management. And in that report, I think it was called the State of Performance Enablement 2023. It talked about the fact that 64% of workers see performance management as a waste of time. And 37% of workers said that performance management is an outright failure in their company.
As an employee, I've been subjected to all kinds of box ticking, stress making, justifying processes. So I've definitely had ones where my bonus was tied to my performance. And so needing to prove things, but then there's also oddly aligned to maybe like the values and the framework, pages and pages of horror. I've been in organizations where there's just not been any performance management. And then at some point realized we should introduce some sort of 360 review. And then they never really went anywhere. And then as an exec, see the point of it, see why we should do it. But then so often it seems to come down to a judgment call anyhow. Or if you try and take the judgment call out of it, it gets too complicated and you get too much about process and not much about what's real.
And you end up with a colossal time commitment that delivers back almost no value to the organization. The question is, what are we trying to get out of it? And leadership and management making that very clear as to what the entire exercise is all about is usually lacking. And it's usually the people person by themselves with really no kind of buy-in or support from wider leadership of the CEO as well. So with that, we talked to Jessica. So she talked about the separation of performance assessment versus performance management. And the way that she characterized this was that performance assessment really is leveling across the organization for pay calibration purposes. And that systematic analysis of assessment is quite different from performance management, which is much more about the individual and the one-to-ones and the career progression framework and really working with that individual to help grow their skills and confidence over the course of time.
So I think there was another element on the performance assessment, which is, are you investing in the right areas? Is your business right-sized? So it's not just looking at, is that the right person in the seat, but should that seat exist at all? And if it should exist, then do we have the right person for it? Which made a lot of sense. I'm not entirely sure that the methodology required to do that. Is it people data that you need, or actually is it business data and metrics that can show you? A really crude example would be the price per SQL for an SDR is 5 times more than an inbound lead. And so how many SDRs do you need? Is it worth having the SDR team at all? And I don't see that you would really need a lot of people data for that. Just kind of taking a step back on what's the right structure of the business.
So when it came to performance assessment, there was 2 subcomponents. One was, is that individual achieving their goals, which is what you're talking about? And the second one is this concept of organizational network analysis, which is how deeply that individual is connected to others and how impactful that person is in helping others solve problems. So there's 2 components that she's spoken about.
I feel more comfortable on the network connectedness and the importance of that, because often you don't know who those very important people are who connect everybody together, which is its own skill, separate to how effective they are in their job until they leave and everything falls apart and you realize what they did. And I think that's a great measure. I had more concern around how hard the goal measuring is, and not because it doesn't intellectually make sense that everybody should have goals and achieve those goals, but more just because in the practical world, and this harkens back to our OKR discussion, are they the right goals? Are they achievable goals? And are people going off in a million different ways? And how aligned are they? And also, how do your OKRs fit into these goals? So I guess combination of a bit worried about, because you know how I feel about OKRs, and then talking about something like Mark Logan's episode on giving agency. And then this felt for me quite command and control, but maybe actually it's not. Maybe it's just providing clarity and it's all down to how you roll it out. And I think you could either roll it out in a very helpful way or in a horrific way.
I think the organizational network analysis, which is how deeply someone is connected to others and how they're helping others to solve problems, that can be systematic and that can be assessed systematically in a way that is fair and clear cut and makes sense. That is very valuable, I think, because when you think about companies that I've worked in the past, you have no sense of this. There's no value placed on it because they don't understand who's actually making an impact. At the end of the day, if we inherently believe in the cross-functional kind of approach to these companies where you solve problems collectively, having different skills, where people are putting those skills together and working in common purpose, being able to measure that in some form feels very powerful outside of achieving goals in this case. And if we can measure that, I love that. I think on the achieving goals side of things for the return on investment part, this is the whole nature of OKRs. I think, to be honest, it requires still a qualitative, smart person to look at the systemic results and to be able to make very good judgments that may not be apparent in the actual data that's coming forward.
I think it would be one where you need to roll it out gently and learn a lot along the way and make sure it doesn't become command and control and cascading OKRs.
At the end of the day, these are commercial companies that need to deliver a payback. Well, that is what a company is about, and that is the contract that you've signed for employment, which is you're being paid money to deliver a result. So being able to have that as part of the performance assessment fundamentally, intuitively is correct. The question is the how of how you actually do it. And if you look at sales and marketing, they're trying to do the same thing, which is create a pipeline of value and convert that into actual customers. And both sales and marketing are doing the same thing. So being in a position where you can measure them collectively and pull back where you're judging not campaign A or MQLB, but you're just saying to the marketers, look, we're going to judge you on the net new pipeline you've created over the course of a quarter, and we're going to judge you on the number of deals that are being signed. That's it. I think if you can kind of pull back far enough, it feels like there may be a way to do what she's saying without getting lost in the granularity around finance with a key result that is very difficult to connect to the reality of the business. So the second thing she spoke about, the line managers doing a very effective job of talking to their reports in terms of their career development and their skill set growth. And her sense of that was not part of her role, and that the line managers were kind of somewhat left to their own devices to figure it out, to do good line management to make that happen.
The obvious caveat is that you have line managers who are good and are capable of doing that. But then after that, you are letting them step back and decide whether or not their team are high performers and recognize the ones who aren't and recognize the ones who are. And they are generally in the best position to tell. The second caveat is we're all massively biased, and not just around protected characteristics bias, but also in terms of things like we generally like people who are like us. So I know that I'm biased towards people who are clear communicators and succinct. And I will tend to hire more people like that, and I will tend to support them more or see more potential. And that is an entire bias on my part because somebody has a shared communication skill with me. And so I do worry that you might not be getting well-balanced teams, and you might not be getting the best out of everybody because of that relationship of the manager and the team member.
I think there is a systemic level of importance that should be put on ensuring that all line managers are leveled in the sense of competence for having discussions around performance management and around career progression. I think what you tend to see is huge variability in people's ability to do that well. And what you want in the company, I think, is a level set where at a bare minimum, they can understand how to take a performance management framework that's being provided to them, understand how to have a conversation around the current level that they're at and what that means in terms of expectations, look at the next level, be able to talk about that in terms of targets for that individual, the kind of things they might think about to get them on the pathway to get to that next level, and timeframes around that and things they might want to flex in terms of their skills, and just being able to have a proper conversation around that, number one. And then number two, making sure the managers understand leadership is expecting them to spend time on this on a regular basis. So why don't we go on a quick break? And when we come back, we will talk to Jessica Zwaan.
So what we're going to talk about today is performance management. And yet I've never seen it done particularly well. Is it actually like the emperor's new clothes? And it's just an impossibility, but it's worth trying anyhow.
I adopt a product management approach in what I do in people and operations. So what I try to do is take as much of the analogy of customer-facing product building and apply it to people ops and operations in general, where it makes sense. And the way that I talk about performance is basically the idea of, are your customers paying? Are your employees performant? And if put in that perspective, understanding the answer to this question is, I think, probably the most important question that you can answer in HR. I do think there are ways to figure out if your team are genuinely performant. The last bit is, I think probably no, the majority of the ways that we're doing that right now do not answer the question effectively or even at all. So many of these things like kind of systemic within just how people operations team and HR teams have been built over the years. And then other parts of them are, I think they're kind of tool based as well. And part of that is, again, because of the customer that these tools are selling to is HR teams.
A more fundamental question is performance management and having a performance management framework the right way to answer the question, are people in your teams performing?
What are people teams responsible for? I'm going to say the most important thing a people team responsible for, like the payback on your investment in people, which means that you have to understand how performant those people are. That's like central to the function of people operations. So if managers aren't doing a good job of that, yeah, sure, it's kind of managers' fault operationally, but like it's people teams' fault systemically. Part of the problem, I think, is that people teams really like to kind of create these like culturally forward, unique, bespoke things, or just copy what other companies are doing, which doesn't always work. And there are, I think, some very specific answers or questions you can ask within performance management or understanding performance assessment, maybe, that do probably get to the answer to this question in a very effective way. The two that I see are like organizational network analysis. How deeply interconnected are your employees within the employee base, and who are they having this like kind of positive behavioral halo effect within? And there are plenty of great tools.
Oh, yeah. Okay. You're about to tell us how to measure that, because I was like, oh, this sounds great, but now what?
There are plenty of great tools that measure your organizational network analysis. Two of them are a tool called, it's built by a team called Encompass Labs, and it's based on peer incentive analysis. And the other one is a company called Performica, which is doing a similar thing, but from like a kind of different angle. Well, what they're trying to assess is the behavioral impact that your employees have amongst other employees. So Performica, for example, will ask the question, who is the person you go to when you need technical help? Rather than, how do you rate this employee's technical capacity? And then what Peerful will do is you will stack rank your employees based on certain competencies and grade them. And then it kind of creates this algorithmic view of who are the people that are strongest connected in terms of these competencies. That is a really effective way to measure one part of behavioral performance. And the second thing that's very effective is a driver tree of goals that impact revenue, and not just asking, what are your goals? Did you achieve them? But also, were they the right goals, and were you the right person to be working on those goals? And I think the final kind of point of this is you should be looking at all of these things as a system and where your team fit within the system. Whereas I think performance assessment has been built traditionally as very much looking at the individual on an individual by individual basis and assessing them against usually a wholly unnecessarily complicated rubric of like competencies and levels and all these words. But it's just not, first of all, human brains just aren't very good at doing that. Research backs this up. And second of all, it doesn't actually give you a good insight into essentially you've got this elephant problem in your company, right? Like performance is an elephant problem. It's understanding the system as it integrates together. And I think this kind of individual by individual performance assessment is ultimately what really holds us back. I'll give a really nice practical example here, which is maybe easily understood by a lot of us, which is, so if you're just looking at outputs, so like goal achievement, and not looking at the organizational network analysis and who is like assisting each other on certain problems and certain goals, your data team may not have a lot of particularly high impact goals. They may be refactoring something or creating a dashboard or something else, right? So if we're looking at them on a pure output basis, so saying just OKR based performance, I think what you'd end up doing is you'd miss the forest from the trees a little bit there. But if you ask the question of like, who are your high performers that are consistently going to the data team in order to help them achieve their goals, what you may end up seeing is actually the data team is a deeply interconnected part of your business where they are not necessarily driving or accountable for a lot of achievement within your business. But if you did not have them, the performance of others would be hindered, if that makes sense. So it's trying to understand where those relationships exist.
So that core question of impact on the organization and delivering results for the organization, not just the outputs, but the actual outcomes. What do you do? Like, where do you even start with that?
I've got a couple of good friends of mine who are working in academia focused on customer lifetime value algorithms. They're building like really complicated algorithms to define customer lifetime value over time. Pete Fader is one of the names. He's a professor at Wharton, and then Dan McCarthy as well, who is a professor, was at Emory. And they are kind of the preeminent experts in the field of customer lifetime value. And I've been talking to them for the last couple of months about how do we build an employee lifetime value algorithm? It's like a driver tree of goals. So rather than just saying sales is very close to the top line, right? So it's very easy to say there's a causal relationship there between 10 million net new revenue and Joe, who works in the business development team, who had a quota of X. It does get more and more difficult the further away you get from OKRs, your top line OKRs or your revenue-based OKRs. But if you are doing, I think, a good job of building goal driver tree, you should be able to see the kind of causal relationships between the work that's being delivered and those top line metrics in some way. Short answer to the question is there's no perfect way to do this right now, but there are better ways to think about it than an individual by individual performance framework with a big back end of PDF documents, basically.
The thing that I'm thinking about with not the social interconnectedness one, but the driver tree, that seems to justify whether or not a team should exist and how much you should invest in that team and if that team is working well. But it's not a performance measurement. And maybe it's performance of a team, but it's not an individual performance.
That's kind of where the ONA comes in. So the organizational network analysis is drawing out the individuals within those teams that are delivering the most kind of cross-network value. And again, there's no perfect way to say like who in the team is the person that is contributing the most value, absolutely. But you will definitely get a better understanding of who in the team is most likely to be the person that is contributing both the most value based on the fact that their team is consistently achieving, they seem to be working on the right goals, and they seem to be deeply connected with others. And also within that team, these two people are consistently mentioned by other people in other teams as being necessary to achieve their outcomes as well. I don't think you're ever going to get to a perfect, like just like customer lifetime value, right? You're never going to get to a perfect place where you're like, oh, this customer is absolutely going to be worth £917 and 23 pence. But you'll have a pretty good understanding of which cohorts and which customers within those cohorts have the higher propensity to be delivering you more value over time.
And so that seems to be able to be a great way of identifying your superstars. What happens after that? Like if everybody always goes to Joe, but there are another 9 people in the team beyond Joe, I suspect that you would need to have more than just Joe. How do you decide what you do with the other 9?
I do see a lot of stuff from founders and CEOs who kind of imply that there is a promised land in which every single person in your team is some kind of exceptional independent superstar that's able to drive your company forward individually. The reality is that just absolutely is not the case. Like I mentioned before, there is this elephant problem. If one person is a superstar that's deeply connected, that is able to drive problems forward, I think you do actually just need other people in your team that are able to fill the gaps of their skills in an effective way. And what you're really always looking for, I think, is the spike. And then where are the people in your team that aren't delivering the value, aren't being mentioned by their colleagues, or aren't delivering goals consistently, or even worse, if you're building a kind of downwards goal mechanism, just aren't even given goals that connect back to top line performance in any way. And then ask the questions about like, are those roles necessary? Is that person the most effective? Hiring is also a risk, right? What you're basically doing, if you take your middle performer, say somebody that's like meeting expectations consistently quarter on quarter, they're like pretty well connected. They're kind of mentioned occasionally within your organizational network analysis. They seem to deliver their goals reasonably consistently and their team is doing fairly well. Terminating that individual, say that their total available value creation is $1 million over the course of their employment. And at the moment they're contributing $750,000. Well, how much does hiring cost? What is the percentage of likelihood that you're going to hire someone better than that person? And then there's like a risk analysis of like, is this like a VP sales, in which case there probably is a pretty big risk in us not replacing this person with someone that's able to contribute more value? Or is this a customer success manager who actually us going back out to market and trying to replace this person and prioritizing this is going to ultimately result in us maybe getting 5% incremental gains of performance over the course of 3 years? Is that really where you should be focusing as a company? Probably not.
Diving into this goal driver tree concept, what is that? How do you apply it? And when it comes to goals for individuals, are you suggesting that from an OKR standpoint, they should be taken all the way down to the individual level? Because traditionally, or at least in some organizations, they stop at the team level.
I've had a couple of conversations with people about this over the course of the last couple of years, really, to think about like, well, how can you actually set effective goals that answer this question? But you start with the top line goals. So say like 10 million net new revenue. Who has a goal that feeds off this? Like who has a supporting goal that is a leading indicator or makes this happen? Well, we've got 150% net revenue expansion. The customer success team owns that. Who is accountable for this goal? Who is consulted on this goal or who assists on this goal or whatever frame you would like to put in? And then are there any sub goals from that? So basically every single time you're asking like, who is the person that's accountable for delivering this and who are the other people that support on the delivery of this goal? And then you continue asking those questions until you get to a point where someone says, there are no sub goals beyond this. This is the kind of the dead end that we get to. And maybe that dead end is write new documentation for the customer support team as it relates to cancellations. Are there any sub goals from this? Nope. But that's 4 rows down from net revenue expansion. And what you have then is individuals that are accountable for delivering that goal and individuals that are contributing to the outcome of that goal. And then what you do at the end of the goal session or the goal period, so maybe it's 3 months, if it's quarterly, or 6 months, whatever you're doing, you ask not just, did you achieve your goal? Yes, no, a binary or a percentage, whatever you want to do. You also ask, was this the right goal for the company to be heading towards? And were you the right person to be working on this or accountable for this? So you're trying to get a forward-looking and retrospective understanding of how effective your goal setting was and who was involved in that. And you can also add another question was there anybody else unpredicted that helped you deliver this goal? So then you can add in, actually, yes, we did speak to the person in BI.
It sounds great in theory. The idea of rolling it out in reality sounds horrific and slow and painful. And what tools do you use? And do you spend more time navel gazing than you do writing stuff?
I guess I kind of put the question on like, do you feel like the current way for measuring performance is spent time navel gazing and writing stuff, and people now just putting things in ChatGPT based on a couple of dot points of feedback?
But it just seems very cumbersome. Does it have to be that cumbersome? And how long does it take? And what size organizations are you talking about?
So we did run like a little baby model on this. So like, how long would it take if you had a team of 5,000 people, if for everybody to deliver this, if it took them a day each or something? And I think we got to the point where it took like just under 2 weeks, that if everyone contributed the things within their time frame every quarter, you would be able to set and complete all of your goals within like 8 working days, basically. In my team, we do basically a version of this. Like we do a very light version, like a Google Sheet, and it takes us 5 working days. But I think we're very soft about it. We do every quarter.
Right. So the first 5 days of the quarter or the last 5 days of the quarter are planning.
Exactly. So our team is just submitting theirs literally today. They're starting to finalize their drafts and who's accountable for what.
And then you use that plus the were you the right person or not questions at the end of the quarter to then take a snapshot on effectiveness, team and individual effectiveness.
The combination of these two things to get to like an understanding of basically kind of answering an ELTV type question is understanding who is connected within the team and working on things together behaviorally, and then who is working on things as it relates to like output, like delivering things.
How often you do these things is always a core question as well, because they all take time, regardless of what you end up doing.
I think there's a difference between giving an individual feedback feedback on how they're doing in terms of their own personal growth trajectory and the work that they're working on day to day, and understanding performance as it relates to the system of your company. I think if you're managing a person, I don't know, I think I'm quite intense about my opinions of this, but I want to have as little to do with the practicalities of management as possible with my team. Like, I mean this in like a hopefully non kind of shrugging way, but I believe that my managers are fully capable adults that are able to deliver feedback effectively in real time to their team and have conversations with them and escalate if there's a problem. So I don't create really strong processes around how to do that. I say, I've got a systemic kind of position that I need to take here, which is to understand how the individuals within the company are working as a whole. In terms of how your individual is working as it relates to their expectations of themselves, that's your domain as a manager. And then I spend the majority of my time focused on systemically, how is our organizational design effectively helping us reach our goals, and where there are spikes within that. So very strong individuals and very weak individuals, and how can we basically improve the ROI of those roles where possible.
Interesting. So you're not actually doing what I would think of as performance management, which is so much of the individual performance management. Do you get this score, that score? How is it tied to your bonus? Yours is much more systemically, how do we structure an organization and is it working? And then you leave it to every manager to decide themselves whether or not the people in their team are performant.
It's not that I leave the managers to decide if their team are performant. Like, the numbers speak for themselves. We're in a kind of specific circumstance at Talentful, I should add here, in that we are a professional services company. So we've just rolled out our first iteration of this way of working. And I've, previously done this in my previous businesses, where we have members of our team who are pretty much everyone is very revenue facing within our delivery team. We have a very clear understanding of like their cost per head and their revenue per head and all those kinds of things. So in some ways, I'm kind of able to cheat a little bit at Talentful because it's so much easier than if you're in an R&D function. I do understand the tension there between R&D and professional services as it relates to performance. I think taking this kind of the idea of performance management back to first principles a little bit here is like, what do I think it's really trying to do is it's trying to work out, is each individual paying you back, right? Is the ROI positive on each individual as it relates to the whole system? I think if some other people ask that question, maybe their version of what is it really trying to do would be to help support individuals to do the best they can or something like that. And I think manager feedback and helping someone grow and understand where they sit within the rest of the team is a conversation that is separate to my authority to some degree. Although I'm happy to help advise them and support them through those conversations if they're difficult, I step away from this idea of we should look at every individual on an individual by individual basis and say, how is Jane Austen comparing against this rubric? And rather, what are the different outputs that we expect from Jane Austen as it relates to her peer? Is she meeting them? Yes, no. And then look at the whole in some kind of calibrated exercise. And then, algorithmically apply compensation changes and those kinds of things. And of course, with some kind of human oversight, but then all the conversations and support and guidance and all that kind of stuff. I guess maybe it's different between like performance management and performance assessment, maybe.
And yet we just call it all performance management, don't we? Whereas actually we mean performance assessment for the most part.
Yeah, exactly.
Getting back to the outputs, if you're looking at it entirely systemically, do we have the right structure? Do we have the right people? We're not talking about Jane Austen. We're just talking about this team. Does it produce? Does it give an ROI? That would be separate to pay in effect, possibly. But you've just said that it is part of pay because you're tying pay into outcomes. But what happens if people are good performers, but you've done this cascading of goals? Everything they've worked on is not valuable and isn't the right things when you ask that question at the end of every quarter, but yet you know that they're actually top performers. So is it part of the responsibilities if you get something you think is bad, you should be able to say, this isn't actually relevant? Because I think we've all ended up doing work that we realized in retrospect wasn't the best use of, didn't move things forward the way we thought a quarter before, which is part of your question. So is it if you consistently are doing the wrong thing, that's a reflection on you not making the right decisions? I'm just thinking of like somebody who's fairly junior, who's being handed from their manager stuff, or would that reflect on the manager not actually goal setting properly?
First of all, I do this quarterly, so it is a lot more live than maybe an annual review where everybody gets a 10% increase if their manager is really nice to them in a form. Companies are here to make money and be successful. And if your employees are consistently not able to deliver on goals that are valuable to a company and they're not connected with other people in the team and having some kind of positive impact, then like, are they actually performing? Like, we are paying those individuals a salary. It's not as if their work is not being recognized in any way. There is a contract there that we have in place. Do we have an obligation to increase that salary or apply a bonus if an employee is not doing the things that we expect to drive more value within your company?
Well, I think the question is, how command and control is it? Where is the decision-making coming for the goals? And I guess I'm just thinking about, you can have bad leaders who end up with teams who've gone totally the wrong way. And that's a reflection of the leader, not the individuals. But in this system, would that be caught?
What is surprising from these tools that measure organizational network analysis is that what you end up seeing is locations where you do have a weak manager and a strong team, where the manager is either reporting that their team aren't particularly effective, but other members of the business are saying, we come to this team regularly. Or you see the overlay of, this team doesn't seem to be achieving the majority of their goals, but actually, as it relates to behavioral connections within the business, this team is deeply connected. They are being referred to as people going to help solve problems, or that are deeply technical and experts in their field. What's interesting about that? And if you're looking at both of those two things together, you shouldn't just be looking at the goal. That's why the organizational network analysis component is so important. Maybe I'll give a useful example from a company of Encompass Labs that I know the CEO of. So the CEO ran this organizational network analysis with Peerful or Encompass Labs. And what was discovered within that, about 300 something employees, I think, they have fully distributed team. They are an e-commerce platform, right? So they ran this organizational network analysis, and what they found was there was actually 3 members of the team who were the highest performing as it relates to org network analysis, right? And there's still the goals separate question that needs to be asked. But in terms of organizational network analysis, in terms of being deeply connected within the business and referred to as being people that are strong in their technical aptitude or their connectivity within the team, 3 people came out on top. Those 3 people were relatively junior members of the data team, and they were all managed by a manager who scored fairly low on organizational network analysis. So what was surfaced up to the C-suite team was there are 3 members of our team who are very, very performant as it relates to being connected to the team, experts in their field, knowledgeable, helpful, whatever other competencies they were looking at. And they're being managed by someone that is effectively shadowing our ability to see those individuals. And maybe on the goals driver tree, you would have found that that team wasn't particularly performant in terms of its goals and outputs. Well, then what do you put together there when you're doing your calibration? It's not, those individuals are poor performers. It's, these individuals may actually have the potential to be a very strong performer. What we have here is a non-performant manager. So I guess the kind of point here is like, yes, I'm a big fan of like algorithmic surfacing of insights, but I think you still need a human being to kind of trawl through those insights and say, what is this story here that I'm seeing? And sometimes the story is, this individual has a lot of potential. We should make an exception here and offer them, an opportunity to work in a different team, or we should, give them a bonus to retain them because it seems like they're quite disengaged. Or it may be this manager is actually deeply ineffective. And if we would have relied on traditional performance assessment where the manager gave everyone downwards feedback, we would never have captured these 3 individuals that have the propensity to be very beneficial for our company as a whole.
How do you do a really good calibration exercise that is connected to pay? Because previously, one of my former companies, they did calibration exercises once a quarter across all the engineers in the company. We had a lot of engineers. We had a lot of levels within engineering, and being able to compare apples to apples calibration-wise really put us in a good position to understand how they fared, to your point, not as individuals, but interconnectedness relative-wise to the other individuals within that wider organization set. And we used that pretty directly for the benchmark salary and where they needed to be pushed to. So what do you think of calibration exercises en masse like that?
If you are working with an individual by individual performance assessment process, basically what a calibration is there to try and do is to do all that systemic stuff I'm talking about. It's there to say, okay, we've now looked at all these individuals and we've got all this data, qualitative data, largely. Now what we need to do is turn it into something more quantitative, like an output, a number on a cell or something, so we can turn that into pay. So everyone sits in a room and has these very long conversations. If you are doing the individual by individual traditional performance assessment method, I believe performance calibration is necessary and incredibly helpful, as you've mentioned. It can be very time consuming, very laborious. It's there to do the hard yards for basically what I think is a fairly ineffective way to actually assess performance or get the data you need for performance. In a world where you are able to take what may feel like a little bit more of a hard-nosed kind of analytical approach to understanding performance positions, that calibration discussion turns into, rather than let's go through and measure where everyone should be in these boxes. Instead, it's about let's tell the stories with the data that we're not seeing otherwise. So it turns into what we were just saying there, which is, interesting. This individual is deeply connected, but they don't seem to achieve their goals. What do we think that means? What's kind of driving that? What other data do we have about this person that helps us tell the story about what's going on here? Or this team is incredibly effective, absolutely smashes it on their goals every quarter, but no one in the company seems to be connecting with them at all. They're complete rogues doing things independently. Is that actually reflective of performance in this company? What does that mean for us? So I think calibration is what it is depending on where you're at in terms of the sophistication of the data inputs you have.
It's interesting because I was feeling like performance management and OKRs are interconnected, as I said at the beginning, and then they are, we're back to this again. So OKRs versus goal setting. As operators, we love a nice spreadsheet. We love everything to interconnect. We love cascading goals and goal setting and OKRs. And then it just hits reality and you end up with a business that is inflexible or overplanned for where it should be or overly rigid and commanding control. So how do you enable the right decisions to be made? How much of it is more around providing context rather than providing an absolutely measurable goal? And if you're going on that context providing way, how do you measure that they've made the right decisions or they've focused on the right things in a quarter?
We do a version of OKRs. It's just a goal that you have that has a parent goal, and that parent goal drives up to our top line goals. And there's someone accountable, and then people that are consulted are involved in those goals. I think this is actually where the kind of softer side of people and operations kind of needs to interconnect. Is I kind of tell my team that it's better to have less goals with more impact. That's always the better option. Don't try to do the kind of traditional Google version of doing things where everybody has an O and then 3 KRs and then an O and then 3 KRs. And what I end up seeing behaviorally there is people get hung up on the rule of what they need to do rather than what they're trying to achieve, right? So if I just say, I'm trying to achieve this 99% retention rate of consultants on any one project, what do you think you can do to help me achieve that? My team says, well, I think that I can do this by implementing this thing or changing this outcome. Then I'm going to make you accountable for that. Who else needs to help you in the team to make that happen this quarter for us? So trying to keep it much more simple, I think. Trying to have more impact, fewer goals, clear accountability, who is helping you. Like really, that's what I'm boiling the driver tree down into. I used to be very big on output only goals. Like I almost would rake my team over the fire of do not bring me input metrics. I will turn you down. I will turn them away. I'm much more comfortable with my team bringing me some input metrics every now and then now, especially for the softer parts of the work that we do. So recruitment, I expect output metrics. People, operations, organizational efficiency. Okay, you can give me some input metrics, but I want to understand what are you trying to affect that is an output metric ultimately.
Yeah, because I think also sometimes you're just laying down the foundations. Like, let's say you need to double the number of leads that you get in, and it's not going to be linear because you're in a really bad situation at the point. So the first half of the year is actually structuring it, and you're not going to know your outputs to the second half, but you better figure out what you're doing in the first half to lay down the foundations. And yeah, I think you do have to be a bit flexible on those.
We live in this world now where we all believe that employees should be empowered. They should be autonomous. There should be guardrails. They should have agency. And the question that always rises with every CEO that I work with is this question of accountability. Are people actually delivering results? And it gets to this question of performance assessment. Can we assess performance to ensure that accountability is taking place, satisfying this urge or need that we have to ensure that people are highly effective, there's a return on investment, and all this talk around empowerment and autonomy, this whole model that we've set up actually works. And the fact of the matter is we don't have a system that works. Maybe I'm posing this to the two of you. What am I missing?
I don't think you're missing anything. I think the shift towards a more autonomous workforce, and particularly more distributed workforce, has made this question become more urgent. And I think the other thing that's helped kind of in the macro effect is like, we're not in zero interest land anymore, baby. We don't have 0% interest rates land. And we have pressure from VCs to be profitable. We have rising costs of running a business. We have team that are getting very disappointed because they're not getting continual pay rises because the market is not strong. So that is pushing us to be more focused on both performance and output than we were a couple of years ago. So I do think that this insight is really truthful in that it feels like this has become more urgent, or feels like it's become more important to think about. And I think it's because it kind of has become more of a strategic imperative for a lot of CEOs and founders and boards.
I feel like it's always been a strategic imperative, but it's just really hard. And with command and control, it was a bit easier to just be able to measure things. And now with more empowerment, we have to figure out more effective ways of doing it. Before we go, if our listeners could only remember one thing and take it away from our conversation today, what would that one thing be?
I think as a COO, the best thing that I have done for my people operations team is to gear them towards the goal that they should be thinking about employee lifetime value and return on investment as it relates to the 65% of my P&L, which is headcount, and making them almost myopic in what are you doing that helps answer the question of like, are we improving our employee lifetime value? If you are having conversations with your people operations team that feel disconnected from that goal or that question, I would be asking yourself a very serious question about, are you actually enabling them to do the work that you really need them to do? I think that would be probably the one piece of advice.
So thank you, Jessica Zwaan, for joining us on the Operations Room. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a comment or subscribe, and we will see you next week.